All right, I'm ready to start warping, or winding my warp chain rather. And before I get started, I wanted to give you a sense of how I've got my space laid out around the warping board, which I'm not sure I've ever really talked about before. So this is the long view of the warping side of my studio. You can see that I've got shelfy things over to the side and hangy things for my small project bags over to the side. The table in front is actually a folding cutting table for sewing. And while it's maybe marginally a little bit awkward having it there, it's not really a problem because it's really handy to set my scissors on or whatever. And the best thing about it is almost exactly 36 inches wide. So when I need to measure my guide string for my warp chain, I can just whoosh, 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 which is what I did today. Though, in fact, at first I forgot that it was a yard wide and not half a yard wide, and I measured a 15-yard guide string. The last thing I want to show you is my warping yarn stand. I found it on Etsy. I cannot remember what it was actually called, but it's a holder for my warping yarns. So let's zoom in a little bit and see what wonderful features it's got. This stand, remember I've got 4 different yarns to work with, has a peg for each of my spools of yarn, and then there's a guide eyelet right above the peg so that I could, if I so chose, and usually I work with this on the floor, I could pull up and do 4 colors at a time with this little stand. The downside I have found is that on a very fine yarn like this bamboo, which is super skinny, uh, the fine yarn can catch in these eyelets. So if I were doing this, if I were making my own, and in fact, it would not be difficult to make your own. Uh, I might choose a different piece of hardware for these guide eyes. The other thing that I have seen people do, and I've seen people do this really, really well. You don't have to have anything this fancy and elaborate. And in fact, often it is easier to wind off from a spool or a cone if it's sorry, not a cone because the weird shape makes it roll unevenly, but from a spool like this that is uniform in diameter all the way across, uh, you could, in fact, uh, set it horizontally. So you could, for instance, kind of make a version of a lazy Kate and just use old metal knitting needles or something in some kind of frame. And that could actually work a little bit better in some situations. So that is my winding apparatus. Uh, the last thing I want to show you is my guide string. Sorry about the jiggling there. So I have already pre-measured a guide string just out of plain old pearl cotton. Um, I think it's I think it's 5'2". You want something fairly heavy because you want to be able to see it. And I have tied it around one of the pegs near where the cross is going to turn around. So as I'm winding this warp chain, the cross end of it will go around this peg and I will wind my cross, and the center of my cross is actually going to be where the little shack logo is. So now that I've got my pre-cut, pre-measured guide string, I'm going to figure out what path I'm going to wind my warp chain on. And sorry, you're going to see a lot of my back in this. Hopefully I won't be blocking what I'm doing. So, like I said, I tied it at the cross end. I just made a simple little knot, and I'm just experimenting at this point. This is a longer warp than I've perhaps ever made. Certainly that I've made in a long time. I tend to do shorter, faster, simpler projects. And so I'm just experimenting, and wow, that turned out pretty well. This is a 14-yard warping board from Shacked, And this is a 7.5 yard guide string. And it turns out through the magic of math that it is not difficult to, that if you just do go around 2 pegs at a time, you end up pretty close to where you want to be at this peg in the corner. Okay, and I stepped away for a second to make sure you could actually see where I was at. And so now I'm just going to tie this other end here on my starting peg. So when I start winding my warp chain, and unfortunately this yarn is a really light color, so it's hard to see in the video against the background of all my sheep stuff. Oh, and it turns out warping boards, because they sit away from the wall when they're fixed on the wall, and you're not messing around with the area between the frame and the wall, it's actually kind of a fun way to frame your art, as I have found. So as I wind this warp chain, I'm going to start at my starting peg, which is this one right here, where my guide string is wound. And then I'm going to wind around, 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 around. And then when I get to the bottom of the frame, I will go under 2 pegs, over 2 pegs, under these last 2 pegs, and then over the 2 at the left. And that's how I'm going to form my cross. And that is the thing that's going to take 364 warp ends in 4 different colors, how it's going to take control of that number of ends and help prevent them from tangling up as I'm warping the loom. I have not yet decided if I'm going to warp front to back or back to front. I am probably going to try back to front just because I haven't done that in a while and I want to keep my skills sharp. But if these are terms that aren't familiar to you, Weft Magazine's brand new issue, which I've only glanced at the table of contents and haven't had time to read, this whole issue is called Warp, and it talks about all the different ways to warp. Janet Dawson's got an article in there about making your warping time, about making your winding of chains more efficient, and she is just a genius at some of these tricks. So names you have heard before, if you've been in the weaving world at all, have contributed and talked about all the different ways to actually put the warp on the loom. And I am hopeful that they've also talked about why it's good to have a wide repertoire. An awful lot of weavers, I have found, uh, only know one way and they only use one, or they only use one way even if they know other ways exist. And just like I did with sussing out the intricacies of my warp color sequence, thinking about how you want to, the method you want to use to warp the loom before you take the chain to the loom can save you a lot of grief. And that's because certain yarns do better warped one method over others, or certain color patterns work better. And then there's the evergreen issue of how do I warp a complicated warp without making mistakes in the threading sequence. So if you haven't subscribed to Weft Magazine, it now might be the time, and or at least get this single issue. This is only the second issue. It's a brand new-ish magazine, and it is all technique based. It is not project based like Little Looms and Handwoven, which I also love because often I need the inspiration of other people's projects and finished designs.